All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining our talk tonight on innovating your career path uh, with Matt Harp. Uh, since most of the talk tonight is Matt telling us about his life, I'll leave the introduction to the talk content itself. So, Matt, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, George. My full first name is actually Matt Naya, which I like it when people use that. You can call me Matt Naya. Some people can just call me OK. So either one is fine. Um, so I'll give a little bit of kind of where I am at right now in my life, and then I'll kind of start from the beginning. So right now I'm 9 to 5 an enterprise architect with Paychex. Enterprise architecture is not always an easy to define thing. It has a lot of different aspects and angles, and everyone can kind of make it their own thing. I'll talk a little bit more about it towards the end. I'm also a serial entrepreneur. I've founded or been involved in the founding of somewhere between 30 and 35 companies. I've kind of lost track, but that's something that I really enjoy and I have a ton of fun doing. And I keep doing whenever I have time. I'm actually in the middle of launching a company right now, which I'll talk more about later in this presentation as well. One of the things I would encourage is if you are listening to this and you feel like I moved too fast through something or like I didn't tell a part of the story that you might be interested in, please feel free. Just stop me, put your hand up, whatever, however you want to do it. You don't have to ask for permission to stop me from talking. Just jump in right away and say, hey, wait till I say something first, but jump right in and say, hey, this is something I want to hear a little bit more about, or ask questions. This isn't intended as a monologue by any stretch of the imagination.
Yes, I fully intend on interrupting Matt and Naya.
Perfect. So I'm going to start with my early life. I was born and raised in Rochester. I've lived here for most of my life, other than 1 year that I spent in Canada when my parents were doing seminary, and 5 years that I spent living in the New York City area, both for college and then a little bit of time after college. I went to NYU and studied physics there. I'll talk more about that later. Some of my first memories, I think, are kind of like formative things to talk about. So I remember my brother breaking his leg, which I was always interested from that point on until the rest of my life, like how something like that would happen and how it would heal. I remember playing with a whirlpool tub in the basement of the hotel type of thing that we lived in, this like high-rise hotel type of thing for a while. I remember watching garbage trucks out my window was like an endless source of amusement. And I remember picking up a hockey stick to play street hockey at school because everyone in Canada did that. Um, and I remember the Buffalo Bills losing habitually in the playoffs. So I'm kind of a lifelong Bills pain sufferer as well.
Interruption, Canada. You grew up in Canada?
I grew up in Rochester, but I lived in Canada for between 9 and 12 months. My parents did a year of seminary, and they're both missionaries. So they go to Haiti every year. My father was just there in January, as was my mother. But they have done that since that time frame, since I was around like 3 or 4, which is the time we were living in Canada. They still go to Haiti every year.
Yes.
Good question. One other thing that I learned when I was a little bit older, when I was back living in the States, we moved back to Rochester and we moved into kind of an inner city neighborhood. It was in the 19th Ward, kind of near Arnett and Thurston Boulevard, if you know where that is, kind of between Thurston and Genesee, where the Boys and Girls Club and Wilson Magnet are. So I lived there from when I was, I think, 4 until I was like 12. I'm not exactly sure the ages, but it was something like that, 4 to 11 or 4 to 12. So if you remember the ice storm, that's the time period that I was living in that house. While I was there, my mother was kind of leaving Kodak as an engineer, and she was previously developing film that they got from spy satellites, which is one of the reasons why Kodak was kind of on the map as both a place to work and a place that would be like under attack if someone ever attacked the United States. Kodak was pretty high up. I'm pretty sure that when she left, she took a whole bunch of computer equipment, because I started, right when she left Kodak, I started finding computers all over the house. And I was like maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I just started using them like crazy. So I was learning to code. I was using the big 5-inch floppy disks that carried a program that would run in just like green keys, green letter text on the screen. That's what I learned on when I was like 5 or 6, I want to say. And I'm pretty sure that my parents either scraped together enough bartering to like get that thing from someone, or they stole it from work. And I still don't know to this day which of those two it was. I got pretty hooked by computers pretty early on. So this was I'm 33 years old. So this was well before the internet. It was well before people had like smartphones in their pockets. It was before people were building websites. It was really like the major programming efforts that were happening at that time were kind of command line, writing things that looked more like COBOL. I learned QBasic and Visual Basic very early on in life, like maybe when I was 8. And I was always fascinated by things like the robotic electronics. So like they call them Mindstorms now, but before there was this whole other thing that didn't even really have a name. It was like Lego robotics or something. I was really into those. When I was in middle school, I started kind of monkeying around with computer hardware, and I built a computer lab. My mom got hired as a computer teacher kind of out of the blue, and she didn't really know how to put together a computer. So I built like 30 or 40 computers over the course of a week or two, and then networked them all into a computer lab when I was in like maybe 6th grade or something like that. And then the same year, I started entering in science fairs, and I found out that I was really good at science. I found like, excuse me, I found this giant spring in a garbage pail in our neighborhood, and I turned it into a catapult. And then I got a bunch of mouse traps, and I built catapults out of them too. And I used like the scientific method to prove why a shorter arm on a catapult can throw things further than a longer arm. So that was like, I had the scientific method in me from pretty early on. While I was doing all of these things, I had this kind of wild family friend, and this was really, I think, my biggest first brush with entrepreneurship. His name was Al. I won't say his last name, but if he ever sees this, I think he'll know who he is. His name's Al. And he would just line me up to do anything. Like it was before, it's hard to think about it now, but in like 1999 to 2002, nobody had websites. It wasn't a common thing for people to have websites at all. So he lined me up with like building websites, and I'd go over to his house and build a website there. And sometimes we were using a framework like, Drupal or Joomla, or we didn't really use WordPress, but like things like that. But we also just built things from scratch. And he was such a wild man that sometimes he would just say like, hey Matt, I got an electric problem in my house. How would you feel about just going down in my basement, stop working on the websites, and we're just going to pull all the wiring out of the house and rewire the house today? Or one time he took me out and showed me a cracked septic pipe in the front yard and just said, just dig me up a 7-foot section of this septic pipe. And I had never done any of those things before. And I just kind of said like, okay, let's see what happens. And I think kind of, okay, let's see what happens has mostly been my motto for most of my life. Like I don't really have any idea what I'm going to be doing tomorrow. So I don't try and predict it. I just kind of go with the flow. And in some cases, going with the flow means standing in a 7-foot deep septic pipe hole in someone's yard who you thought you were going to build a website that day. But I learned a lot there. And one of the things that I was working on was an online video dictionary for deaf and hard of hearing people. And people would come in from other countries, from Japan, I think, to listen to people that were affiliated with his organization. Excuse me, I'm having a little trouble with my voice.
All the talking we did beforehand.
Yeah, you wore me out. So that was kind of a wild time where on any given day that I would go over there, it could be, hey, I need you to film a video, or I need you to jump in front of the lighting set and like figure out the lighting, or I need you to build the website, or I need you to post these things to YouTube. And it's just, you never knew what was happening. And I think that taught me a lot about how to be like resilient during your workday, and also how to be very innovative in the tasks that you pick up, because you never knew what was coming. Like it was absolutely things out of left field. You'd be working on one thing, and he'd just, Al would come and grab me and, hey, I got to hang this TV in my house. I need you to go measure some angles and cut some boards. Like that's how my day would go all the time. And I think I learned to kind of appreciate that, the blast of inspiration, something that needs to be done right then. Now that's kind of there's a counterbalance to that in that it's not very stable. So if you don't have someone who's like doing the stability exercises around that, you're in trouble. But that's something I learned a lot from. Let's see, through most of high school, I did stuff like that. I was building websites for profit, like having people pay me to put a website together. When I was in high school, I wanted to be an architect and or a mechanical engineer. And I realized the irony that now I am an architect, but it's not the type of architect that I thought I was going to be. I thought I was going to be like building a house, but now I'm architecting software. Once I found out how much work that actually was, like once I started doing college visits and they told me how much work it was to do architecture, just to like cut these little things out of balsa wood and glue them together, I was like, screw that. I don't want to do that. I don't feel any kind of joy just like putting 2 pieces of wood together with glue and stacking them on a table that no one's ever going to see. Like I didn't want to do any of that stuff anymore. So instead, when I went into college, I went into physics. and mechanical engineering still, but instead of doing architecture, I did physics. And I enrolled in two schools at the same time. So I enrolled in NYU for physics and mechanical engineering at Stevens Institute of Technology. And I was playing volleyball at a competitive level. That's part of how I got there, is I got a partial sports scholarship to go. There were some wild stories that I could tell about college. One was, I remember distinctly being like on my way into class, and the graduate students had formed a picket line outside of our school building. I think it was the library, actually. And I remember someone coming up with a megaphone like this far away from my face and screaming "scab" in my face, like I was crossing a picket line on the way to school. And that was like kind of a formative experience for me, because I was someone who was paying to be there, and they were a college grad student who was getting paid to be there, and they were standing there yelling down their megaphone at me. Like it rubbed me the wrong way, and it's something that's kind of stuck with me since then. Also because it was so loud that I feel like I blew my eardrums out. Yeah, George, were you going to say something?
Yeah, what were they picketing or protesting?
They were being paid $13,000 a year or a semester, I can't remember what it was, to be college grad students. And they said that that was not enough. They wanted more money. Have you ever seen the episode of South Park where they do like Canada's closed for business because they want more money? Mm. That's basically what it felt like. And, you know, I was there paying, I didn't have a full scholarship. I was paying some money to go there. And like, I think my lodging basically worked out to 13 grand a year. And I was standing there looking at these people like, what the hell are you complaining about? You know, like you're not supposed to be here for forever. You're supposed to learn something in college and then get kicked out of the nest. Like if people just keep giving you $13,000 or more a year, why would you ever go out into the real world? And maybe that's what they wanted to avoid. I don't know. So I can talk more about that later. One of the things that happened to me when I was in college is I hurt my knees, and I knew that I was not keeping up physically enough. Like I'm in good shape, but I wasn't in good enough shape to be playing every day. So I stopped playing volleyball, and then I kind of had like an identity crisis. I didn't really know, like, if I'm not playing volleyball, that's kind of how I defined myself. Like, who am I? So I dove really deep into like philosophy and psychology, studied a whole bunch of different religions, like very actively. And then I kind of realized how good I was at computer science stuff, and I started doing that on the side. So I picked up a research job at NYU where we were building algorithms to predict the motion of thermally convective plates. So I'll say that in a different way, watching how the interior of the earth heats up the crust of the earth and causes it to move around. And we were kind of making some general observations that eventually led to a paper that was published, which I got to get my name on. I thought that was kind of cool. And then I realized nobody ever reads those freaking things. So like, it's a really cool thing if you get published there, but no one ever sees it. It's not like you built a cool piece of software that everyone goes on and they sign into every day. You have your name on a paper somewhere in a dusty old library, and that's where it stays. And maybe it sees a magazine if you're lucky. So I was a little turned off by that. And after I got my undergrad degree, I started doing graduate level classes in quantum physics and high energy physics that were kind of tagging on to stuff I had learned in undergrad. And I came back to Rochester and thought that I could work for the laser lab for energetics. So I was like doing all the studying that I needed to get my PhD. And while I was doing it, I still had this like bad taste in my mouth from the practice of publishing, and then getting called a scab for trying to go to one of my classes. And I started picking up tutoring gigs where people just said like, we'll give you 50 to 60 bucks an hour to go teach my kid. And that was a hell of a lot of money at that time. Like that's like 3 times what an entry level software developer was getting paid at that time, at least 3 times. So I just kind of said, screw school. Like I'm going to go start making money. So I did. And I started an education company. It was called Harp Education. When my brother graduated college, I hired him on and one other person. And we just took all of the best tutoring jobs in Rochester, especially on the east side. I had no previous experience in tutoring. I had no previous experience in like the business of tutoring, but I just kind of said like, what the hell, let's give it a shot. And that's, if you sense any theme, that's probably what you can see out of me is I never really know. I'm comfortable with the uncertainty at a very high level because I think that people fool themselves all the time into thinking they know what's going to happen next. And that's a dangerous thing. So while I was doing tutoring and while I was kind of dropping out of grad classes, I was still doing stuff with Al. And it was this like kind of yin and yang type of thing where the tutoring was very standard and I could max out my schedule as much as I want. I could charge whatever I want. And I knew exactly what my schedule was like every day. when I was working with Al, it was very volatile and very disruptive, and it was a little too much for me. So I actually took another tutoring gig for Monroe #1 BOCES. And again, I had never done anything like this before. I didn't come through, the standard educational pathway, but I opened up a tutoring center for them in Fairport on Balmer Road and operated that for students who were in and out of difficult situations, maybe some mental health problems, some rough housing situations. Some of them were on their way back from jail or on their way to jail. And I did that for a little while. Then the next year, I did the same thing in East Irondequoit. And that was definitely a rougher clientele. We had people come to our tutoring center with like guns trying to kill some of our students and things like that. Like it was pretty dangerous, actually. We had to call the cops a couple times. And there were some people there who had really kind of lost their way and been taken advantage of as well. I met my wife while I was working there, and I tell some jokes about kind of like what my mental state was like at that time, but I'll save that for a different type of thing. But one of the things that exposed me to is like these two different tutoring clientele, and the education system, how it is lined up for very different mechanisms or means for two different types of people. So I was getting these like ultra high performing perfectionist clients whose parents wanted them to have 100 on everything. And I was working with them getting paid 50 to 60 bucks an hour. And I was also working with people who were very close to living on the street and not getting paid anywhere near that. I was doing it basically out of the goodness of my own heart and getting paid like under minimum wage to do this thing during the day. So while that was going on, the school organization from Minnesota contacted me and asked if I would open a school in Rochester under their umbrella. And I just said like, sure, what the hell? I met the guy, just sat down with him and said, this is how I would do it. This is the way I would teach the kids. And they brought me on as an assistant director of education and COO. So I had held positions like that in tech companies before, but I had never held a position like that in a education company before. That was my first exposure to like systematic fraud. And I got to go through a situation with someone, and I view it as kind of like a positive experience now, but when it was going on, what I saw is that there were fraudulent people who were just kind of pushing things through just by bullying everyone out of the way. And when you actually dug into it, you just found like massive financial misallocation, people like cooking the books and all different stuff. It was wild. One of the guys that was affiliated with that had a partner in another state that put a shotgun in his mouth and blew his head off while I was working with him. So like that's an alarm bell. If you ever, just in case anyone's ever wondering what an alarm bell looks like for fraud, if one of your other partners in another venture blows their head off with a shotgun, start asking some questions is my advice. Especially if people are saying things like, it isn't fraud. If you hear someone say it isn't fraud, our CEO assured us, you're probably on a fraudulent path. So that was eye-opening to me. When I was doing that, I was 26 years old, and I was running the school with a bunch of kids in there of all different ages. We had kids as young as 7th grade and kids as old as juniors, I think, in high school. And I didn't even know how to skate, but most of the kids were ice hockey players. So I kind of took an attitude of like, what the hell, what if I just fall on my face a little bit? And I learned something. I learned how to skate when I was 26 years old, and then started learning how to play hockey against these kids, and then started learning how to play hockey against adults. And when I was talking about this earlier, I was kind of talking about the rules and assumptions that happen around schools. And one of the things that I found is there are a lot more assumptions than there are rules. So I think George reflected to me, and I'm going to ask George to speak his quote very literally again. What was it that you said, George?
Oh, man. Do I even remember it this time? I'm sorry.
I wrote it down. What George said to me is that the world is full of arbitrary bullshit.
Yes, exactly. I agree. I did say that.
Right. So that's what I found too in the process of starting a school, was that I just started asking questions like, why does someone only get to take a test one time? Like, why do we do that? Is there anywhere else in, like, other than picking up a credential, let's say you go get Microsoft certified or Google Cloud Platform certified or something like that, you can still you can take that test again if you fail, right? So why do we put kids in this kind of pressure cooker where we say, okay, there's a test on Friday, you have 3 days to get ready for it, and if you fail it, you fail it. So I just said, like, I don't think that's a rule. I think that's an assumption. And instead of doing it that way, what I did was tell my students, I'm going to give you tests that are harder than what you know how to get 100% on, and you're going to fail on some of these questions. And then you're going to sit down and study your failure, and you're going to take it again. And then if you still fail to meet the level that you want to, you have to come talk with me about why you think that you failed, but I can give you another attempt to try it again as well, if you have that conversation with me. And I thought that much more accurately modeled what a life experience around a test event would look like. That it's not a one-time trial. Most of the time, if you fail something like that, as long as you're still alive at the end of it, it's not like people say you can never try that again. I don't know where that crept its way into the minds of educators, that they said we have to have a high stakes testing environment. And I think that it's just this assumption that has lingered through education for decades. And I don't really understand where it came from. One thing that I know it could come from is that the test companies, the people that write the test, the way that they do that might feed into it. But I really don't know the reasons why. So I just kind of said, like, I'm not going to do that. And I did, so I didn't. And I was in a position in the school where I could just kind of make the rule that it's fine. If you failed the test, let's say you got a 40, we're going to sit down and we're going to study up. We're going to go back and read all the material. And the test questions were randomized, so you wouldn't get exactly the same test the second time. Oh, I should say this was a hybrid online school. So actually all their books and tests and everything were done through a computer. And there were still people present in the school itself, like talking with them on a regular basis. But they kind of had the automated part of it where they could, once they learned how to do this process, they could actually walk themselves through the process of taking a test, not getting the score they wanted, thinking about whether they wanted to try it again, and then trying the test again. And they were encouraged to do that, right? I would do the same thing for their athletic training. I would make sure that their instructor was giving them things that we knew that they could not do. So that every single day when they were getting their athletic training, there would be micro failures. And we would just work through those micro failures until you could get to a point of, I taught this thing called the failure bandwidth, where you're starting down here, and if you failed, you might hit this bottom. But as they become more successful, you also teach them what failure looks like. And then they become more successful, and you teach them what failure looks like again. And it's gradually ratcheting up their failure bandwidth until you are only operating in this plane here. And that was a very, very powerful tool for a lot of the students that were there. And I have kept up with quite a few of them, and they are very, very resilient individuals, like far more than the usual student at their age. I think partially as a result of that. Let's see, one of the other things that I would say about that time period is there will be times in your life where you know something is wrong and you don't speak up because of some other motivation. Like for me, people made some bad decisions around the founding of the second school that I got involved with, not the fraudulent one. They weren't fraudulent. They just made some stupid decisions. And I knew they were stupid at the time.
But you said I'm supposed to challenge anytime they say you're not fraudulent.
What's that?
You said challenge anytime they say we're not fraudulent.
Yeah, so that was for the first school, right? And then the second one was not a fraud situation. It was just good intentions with bad execution. Was much more the second one. I know they meant really well, but like some people got in each other's ears that it had to be a certain way, and they didn't really know what they were doing. And it kind of hamstrung us for a little while. So one of the things that I learned there is be comfortable speaking up, especially during initiation stages. Make sure that if you feel misaligned with someone, there's probably other people in the room that feel misaligned as well. And be the voice that steps up and says, I see a misalignment here. It'll go far. Let's see. I also found some amazing students there who I kind of treated like my children by the time that I left. I don't have any kids yet. I have 2 dogs, but no children. And I found I really have a joy of creating things. And like creativity is something that people talk about it on and off, like where it comes from and how you teach people to enjoy creativity or how to teach people to be creative. I think that there's not really enough recognition of that need to teach creativity. Creativity comes from like fun. That's I think the source of creativity is like doing something that's on the boundary of what people might call inappropriate and kind of playing with that line. That's what creativity is, right? It's breaking the appropriate boundaries and doing something that's a little bit outside of the box, coloring outside the lines, or doing something outside the box, or thinking outside the box. There's a reason those are all statements about a bounded space that is treated in a way that's unfamiliar to that bounded space and steps over it. So that was an area where I really kind of focused in on and said, like, where would creativity come from for these kids? And I encouraged them to make like mantras and mottos on their own that would kind of express their creativity. While I was working at that school, I was confronted with an opportunity. Not confronted with, I was shown an opportunity to jump and become a chief product architect for a startup company in Rochester, which I won't go into the details of it. But looking back at it, I knew that it was risky. I probably still would have made the same decision, but the company really kind of blew up and almost folded within about 6 or 7 months of me rotating over there away from the school. So I gave up the school that was a big part of my identity and like a big part of me. I was a college student athlete and it identified with me, or I identified with it. And when I moved over to this new startup, I kind of gave all that stuff up. And, that's something that could be a regret if I believed in regrets. It's more something that I know I want to try again, is try the school portion again. While I was like working on this startup and everything blew up, I kind of took a stability route for the next part of my life. So when this startup kind of folded and imploded almost, I went over and started working at U of R, and I was doing enterprise architecture work there, but they don't really have an enterprise architect title, or they didn't at that time. They called them programmer analysts, which is like a goofy freaking title altogether. But I worked on bringing Epic, their electronic medical record system, in. I worked on a bunch of ERP tools in both the med center and academic side. So like bringing Workday into the company and bringing a materials management or a supply chain product into the company. I did not enjoy working for U of R at all. I was habitually punished for speaking up when I saw like computer software vulnerabilities, and things got pretty, let's say, heated at times there, because it was a hostile workplace. I guess I'll just say that it was a hostile workplace environment. But while I was there, I met some great people. I met a couple of people who were like forward thinkers. I had a chance to go to some of the AIM Center meetings and meet some of the people at iZone who are kind of trying to build the entrepreneurs of the future. We could talk about whether that's successful or not. And I also got exposed to the Rochester Data Science Consortium, which is working on some really cool data science problems. And then I met someone who, I don't mind saying his name here, Nasir Ali is someone who is let's say he's a venture capital guy who runs an incubator and accelerator out of the Syracuse region, I think. And he kind of started using me as like an entrepreneur in residence and had me consulting on a couple of people that he would bring up and say, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? And that was really one of the first times that I kind of sat on the other side of the table, the investment side of the table, or the idea analysis side of the table for a startup. And that was a very enjoyable thing for me. I still enjoy kind of doing that rapid refinement process. I worked there for 2 years. I worked at U of R for 2 years, and I can honestly say, in spite of a few projects that I did, which I brought like an artificial intelligence platform into U of R, it was probably the least productive 2 years of my life. And that includes like before I learned to read. Like everything there was just locked in status quo, and people were terrified of change. So I didn't really enjoy my time there at all. After those 2 years, I jumped over to Paychex, and it was like someone turned a light bulb on inside my brain or inside my heart or inside my soul or something, because people there like innovative ideas. And I know that's kind of a new thing to hear about Paychex, but it's true. People there like innovation.
I think it depends on the department you're in there too.
I agree with that too, right? So my department is probably closer to the innovation edge and can like come up with innovation strategies, where other departments might be more tactical, kind of looking down, boots on the ground type of work. But the corporate culture there in and of itself was a massive breath of fresh air on my end. I also have a great manager, absolutely great manager at Paychex. Now at Paychex, I spend time. So I wrote a book recently on servant leadership called Rise: Fundamental Patterns of Servant Leaders. I have a copy over here I can grab later. But it's available. Like you can go pick it up on Amazon. I encourage you to. And I like let everyone know at Paychex that I was doing that, and they didn't like hand slap me. They bought the book instead, which was like, you could see how an organization would say your focus is on other things, but instead they said like, no, we want to read this. And we want to know more about it. So that was pretty cool. I also get to do a lot of work on corporate strategy and some work on software architecture. Like I'm rebuilding a lot of the tax. I'm not doing it myself, but I'm re-architecting a lot of the tax product for Paychex. And then I get to do a lot of like theoretical work on corporate metacognition, which is like how companies think about themselves, which is a really cool space to be in. And I get to do a lot of these from a mixture of like a leader role and someone who's a contributor. So it's a very, very cool role that I'm in. And I kind of bring my own blend of approaches to it, but it's something that I enjoy. The next thing that I'm working on is called Techiner, That's a new startup company that is probably going to be, my future side hustle effort, so to speak. And basically that's an idea of taking what currently look like caged ideas and exposing them into something that can become a very valid idea. I have this speech that I put together that I'm still looking for a platform on where exactly is the best spot to put it. But it's on converting what we know as the Rust Belt, so kind of the space between Albany and maybe Chicago, from being called the Rust Belt to be called the Refinement Belt. And the idea would be that we are refining ideas, we're refining product, we're refining people as individuals, and that we start calling ourselves that way instead of calling ourselves part of the Rust Belt, which is this it's got a really negative connotation to it. What if we started calling ourselves the Refinement Belt? Let's knock the rust off and start refining each other, refining our brains, refining our tasks, refining our ideas, refining our businesses. And I have this speech that I put together that I am really looking for a place to drop that speech. I was charged by a bunch of local and non-local venture capital groups to kind of define the current entrepreneurship network and any challenges that exist, make a map of the impactful people who are circled around this region, and then an assessment of the current state, like how do things currently look right now? And that's something that I like doing. That's something that I like help on too. So if anyone hears this and you're like, yes, that's me, Matt and I, reach out to me, just put your email in the chat and I would love to have a conversation. But that's really what I want to align myself to in the future, both in the corporate space, at Paychex, if it works out there, and also in kind of the startup space, is I like being aligned near innovation acceleration spaces. So the idea for Techiner really is that it's an app you have in your phone where your ideas go from idea stage to be rapidly refined and then eventually be presented to the world.
How do you spell that?
TEKKINER. And I do have a homepage up, but it only recently went up. I'll just throw it in the chat. And you'll see very limited bare bones type of stuff there, and that's okay. But I am going to be working on that in the near future. So I apologize that you're getting kind of the rough draft, but I do believe in the power of rough drafts. And if you read anything on there and say, hey, this could obviously do way better, please tell me how. So one of the things that I was talking with George about and that I said I would call back to, and I think this is probably a good transition comment to the segue, or transition comment or segue to the Q&A session, is that people leave Rochester all the time. And especially if you're an innovative person, you might see greener pastures somewhere else and just say like, what the hell am I doing here? And for me, I know part of the answer is family. Part of the answer is that I love this city and I can see that it can be more. Part of my answer is that really this city needs a champion or an advocate to say we can be more and then have people start thinking that way. And I don't know that that's me, but if it is me, I'd be happy to do that. And I think that there are, thank you, Tom, for posting that. I really appreciate it. He just posted a link to my book for anyone who didn't catch that. But that's something that I would like to see happen more. And I have, I think that a lot of people have visions for what Rochester could be, that it could be something that has this kind of hotbed of new startups that are kind of burning away some of the old legacy infrastructure that still exists and still kind of cripples the downtown area of Rochester. So there's this giant crater in the middle that we keep hoping someone like Xerox or Kodak will come back and fill. And I don't think it's Xerox or Kodak, and I don't think it's a mega corporation. I think it's a bunch of small startups that are going to start filling those spaces. And I know quite a few people that agree. So I'll stop there and say like that's kind of a good charge to the people here, is to think about whether that's true. And George, I don't know if you wanted to say anything next or line anything up, but I'll cede the floor to you.
Just one fun thing with a segue, talking about the Rust Belt. Next month's talk is on the programming language Rust. So
nice.
All of you should attend. We didn't plan that, but it's too perfect not to mention.
Perfect.
So yeah, make sure everybody signs up. I think it's the 16th of July. I took some notes for some questions, but I will give a 30 seconds for someone else to interject before I go through my list.
And just so everyone knows ahead of time, like nothing is off limits. So feel free to ask me anything as directly as you want to. But go ahead, Rob.
Just one thing. Instead of going through life thinking that your mom ripped off Kodak, having worked at Kodak about that time, they used to dispose of all sorts of computers and stuff. I mean, they would just pile them in dumpsters, and you could take them home if you want them.
That's good. That's good. Good information awareness. I appreciate that. Maybe if I ask it that way, she'll tell me like, yes, that's what happened. But every time I've asked her before, she's gotten a little dodgy about it. So that's good advice, though.
Maybe she was charged with putting it in the dumpster.
Yeah.
And just...
But no, it's a good point, Rob. You're right. I wouldn't want to operate under an assumption just based on a non-answer. So.
Oh, and by the way, when you say you started out with the big 5 1/4, the big ones were 8-inch.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's true.
Hey, we had our old tech meetup a few months ago, all right? I don't think Chris really liked that.
I can break out the faceplate, but we're having a different talk today.
Sure.
So George is going to ask a question, but one thing you should all, I think, ask is, like, did I ever think I knew what I was doing? And the answer is no. I still don't know what I'm doing. Like, I'm one of the top technical talents in Rochester. I know that I am. I know that I'm a very smart person. I don't always believe that, but I am. And I still don't know what tomorrow or the day after brings. Like, and that's how I like it. But yeah, go ahead, George. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump you there.
No problem. So earlier you were talking about uncertainty, not knowing what tomorrow is going to be, and people almost making assumption that they can predict what tomorrow will be and behaving with that assumption.
Yep.
I think there's another piece of that, and that is almost capping your downside risk.
Yep.
Right. And I think you kind of also touched on that, talking about the two different types of clients that you would have in tutoring, right? Some whose downside risk was not eating today, and others whose downside risk was getting a 95 instead of 100 on a test. Not to
Exactly
tongue in cheek that too much, but I think that's actually super accurate. So how much do you think having a higher floor is necessary for creative entrepreneurship behaviors?
Okay, so
I said it wasn't going to be an easy one. That's why I wanted 30 seconds for other people to interject.
I think it depends on what stage you are yourself in during the entrepreneurship journey. So if you are someone who is a new entrepreneur and you're working with someone who has a high floor already, and they're kind of to a certain extent insulated from some of the failures that might occur, you can be the person who has like no floor and is perfectly comfortable with the bottom falling out underneath you, and you just say like, whoa, okay, I'm definitely not going near that again. That was the Grand Canyon of all mistakes, and it's going to take me a while to like think about how I actually got here. But if you're the person who's looked to, I think that's kind of how entrepreneurs in a certain state kind of judge the evaluation of others, right? So is this person coming on stable enough on their own that if something goes wrong on my end, they can kind of lift me up? And I think that it's not so much a question about an individual having a floor. It's kind of the communal floor of the co-founders or communal floor of those who are nearby you, where you know that they have your best interest in their mind. And if you, like, I just had a situation like this 2 weeks ago where I just completely went MIA for reasons I don't have to go into, but I'm willing to, but basically a family issue, and was completely off the charts and off the map for close to 2 weeks. And when I came back, the questions weren't like, Matt, what the hell are you doing? You know, you should have been there, all those things. It was, Matt, are you okay? How can we help? Right. So to your question about the floor, maybe my floor was lower than the person who was asking, are you okay? Or can you help? Or maybe their floor is lower and they just haven't had something that like knocked them down yet. I think it really depends more on having a common moral compass and having a common set of aligned ideas that are kind of like a somewhat similar vision of the future. And raising the floor is really a mechanism of measuring progress rather than it is a measure of preventative failure mechanisms. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking of the founder who if this business doesn't go well, can't keep going with it, right? Like they only have 10 grand saved up,
And they
but they
don't have
have
any
the
co-founders. They don't have any co-founders with them.
even if they do, and maybe all three co-founders each have only 10 grand to go, right?
Yep.
Your runway's not that long.
Yep.
Are we losing a lot of things because of that? And then so that kind of also is going to tie into my feelings on risk aversion in our founding angel network and all of that crap in Rochester. And we don't provide the runway unless you're a very specific type of business that is going to hockey stick in the next 6 months.
Yep.
So I think
you're coming close to, like, I can kind of jumpstart your comment here. So you're coming close to saying, like, what I think happens there is those founders that only have a $10,000 runway and they might fail in 6 months and they have nothing else. That idea stalls. It's not that idea usually gets made and then people run it into the ground. It's usually people say, like, well, what would happen if I started this and I lost everything? And that's just the fear of failure.
Sure.
Because it doesn't have a floor, right? Like that could fall all the way off the map. They could lose all of their money, lose the time that they put into this thing, right? Those people they talk themselves out of doing that is what happens. They don't found the company at all, is my experience. Now, there are some who would disagree with that and say, yes, every now and then a company gets founded and all they have is if all you have is $10,000, you might be, unless you're doing something that's like a guaranteed home run, like you're going to make something that makes money very near term, you're probably in trouble if you have $10,000 of cash reserves and 3 people on board as co-founders and no one looking to invest in it. You got bigger problems. And maybe you shouldn't be making that company. But that's more what I see. The other thing I would say is, if anyone's familiar with prospect theory, or maybe if you're unfamiliar with prospect theory, this is a prospect theory problem, right? So I'll put the Wikipedia link in there real quick just for everybody. But like the graph that you see when you look at the first section of prospect theory, that's what's going on in people's heads. It's an asymmetrical success graph that basically says, if I fail big. And if I succeed, I don't succeed at the same capacity at which I would receive returns as compared to the negative returns that I get if I fail, right? So that kind of asymmetrical S curve is exactly the prospect that George is talking about.
Yep.
Which is, I know that the failure feels more painful and more impactful than the success feels joyful.
Loss aversion.
Yeah, loss aversion. And so when you say loss aversion, I actually think more about big corporations making loss aversion decisions rather than the small company that's starting up. Like loss aversion through planning it blows my mind that companies still do it this way. They plan not to lose things, right? Have you ever been around someone who plans not to lose things? You know what they do in their house? They stack shit in the craziest places that you could ever look. Like that's how someone plans not to lose things. They just say, like, okay, if I put it here and I put 10 other things with it and like I have all this context, I'll be able to find it. You don't plan not to lose things. Like that doesn't even make any sense.
Well, yeah, that goes into why large companies have so much waste.
Yep, absolutely.
Right, because you bury everything into a corner. You've buried the valuable thing in the corner, and it costs you to get it out.
Yep. Or there's only one person in the company who knows how to do anything with it. But yes, you're right.
Oh yeah.
So like those were good questions, George. Those were great feeder questions, and those, like, I tried to answer that one very directly, but there's like a book that could be written on the question that you just asked.
There's also I was very hand wavy, kind of trying to tee you up for another thing that we were talking about earlier. The working your 9 to 5 and then doing some side work afterwards.
Yep.
So if you have that short runway, can you extend it with a day job?
Yes. It's not easy though. You won't sleep very much.
Right. Or the family can just, do whatever.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that's, for me, I don't have any kids yet, but if you have young kids in the house, that becomes all but impossible. Like if you have any children that are under the age of like 6 or 7, there's no way that you're going to be able to get home from work, calm the kids down, get them a meal, take like a brief mental sanity break, or like go outside and yell at the sky because you're so freaking drained from all the stuff that you've done, and then sit down and build something impactful at like 9 to 12 o'clock at night. It's not going to happen. So I would say make good use of your vacation days if you're someone in that situation. Like take a vacation day to work on a passion project, make it a 3 or 4 day weekend, so that by the time your kids come home at the end of the day, they're more of a pleasant distraction from something that might have frustrated you with your side project. And I don't have children myself, so I would just say I've done this with my dogs. There's like dog daycares. And if I have something that I really want to get out of my brain into a project, I'll put them in a dog daycare for a day. And that costs me like $40 or something like that. But it's a mental sanity break that I need. Right. And I need them to come home tired and exhausted from having played with a bunch of other dogs and then let me decompress at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, so there's another piece of innovating a career path, at least in terms of, I'll say like what I'm doing. So Matt, you laid out a lot of the things that you've done. I'll also just throw in something that I'm thinking of now. So a year and a half-ish ago, I was doing the 2 jobs, right? I had the 9 to 5, except I didn't work 9 to 5. The core hours for the company ended at 3. So I worked 6 to 3. My kids conveniently also got out of school at 3, right? So I could maximize time there.
Yeah.
And then they would go to bed at like, 7:30, because they were still younger. My oldest is 5 now. So they still went to bed early. And then I could work 8 to 12, repeat, wake up at 5, go to work by 6, 3, repeat. The time discipline required to do that and not lose your family is huge, right?
Yeah,
and the problem I had there is that, as you said, like it's a lot. It's going to kill you in a few months. And 3 months later, I couldn't do it again, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, that was a side contract. It wasn't for a product build, so I didn't have to worry about it going forever. So we got the contract done, 3 months. It was great. Why do the second job? Why is a contract? It's still something I'm thinking about now. Paying off debts. So like I have a house. I didn't pay for my house in cash. I'm only 32. I didn't have that kind of money 7, 8 years ago when I bought it. Cars cost money. Student loans still exist. I still got debt. So I'm thinking longer term. Can I pay off all of my debts by the time I'm 40 so that when my kids enter high school, which should be about then, I can work on startups full time? I have a longer runway because I don't have to worry about debt payments every month.
And it's your personal runway you're talking about now, not the runway.
Right. So I'm trying to set myself up for more flexibility later.
Yep.
While also, being around when my kids are awake.
Yep. That's very, very difficult. And kudos to you for doing it. That's an extremely difficult thing. And it usually comes with extreme sacrifices, like you don't get to work out as often as you'd like, or you don't get to go do things that are your hobby. Like that, it's a big sacrifice.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm kind of doing is building a community of people, right? I mean, I started this 5, 6 years ago now. It's grown bigger and faster, and I've dealt with more problems there than I ever thought I would. Holy crap. Anyway,
if I could give you a hug right now through the computer screen, I feel like that's amazing. I can give you a hug. Man.
Chris knows about one of the problems that we had to deal with not too long ago. Oh boy, Kendall too. But one motivation there is, there's certainly all of the benefits that all of the members get. Like that is number one. But there's also, there's no such thing as altruism in my mind, right? I'm still benefiting because I know all of you now. And if any of you have a startup idea, I can now find you. And you know me and you'll hire me. Isn't this wonderful?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I'll kind of leave the door even further open on that. So Paychex is still hiring people who are very experienced software developers. And if that's something, they're hiring software architects, which is the role that I do, or enterprise architecture, which enterprise architecture and software architecture are sometimes treated as two different things, but the lines are kind of blurred at Paychex. So if people are, if what I described about the workday at Paychex interests you, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to have a conversation and tell you more about it. I would also say I already found my own company that I'm currently running, and I'm always looking for people who do exactly what George just said. Say, there's people around me who are doing good things, and I'd like to be involved with doing good things. So feel free to reach out to me on that front as well. I want to hear a question from someone other than George. So
Yeah, please. Don't make me call on you. No, I wouldn't do that.
Is anyone on the call not from Rochester?
No, actually, I was just gonna pipe in if you can hear me.
Yep, you're good.
Yes.
All right, cool. I just have to say I worked at U of R very briefly, and yeah, it's a very, very toxic, horrible. Glad to be out of there.
This will be on YouTube, just in case anybody wants to know.
Fine by me.
I do have editing abilities in case anybody does think later that they'd like a question removed or something. I don't know.
Rob, did you have more to say on that front, or is that?
No, not really. I just had to pipe it and agree with you, and make it look like I'm not a bot sitting here.
You actually look like a rainbow is flying out of your eyeballs.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to show my this part you can cut out, please. I don't want to show my messy bedroom, so I put up the virtual background.
I'm in my basement.
I have Nyan Cat flying behind me, and the lighting doesn't quite work.
That's okay. It looks cool. I saw Jody put her hand up when I asked if anyone was not from Rochester. Is that right?
Yes, I'm not from Rochester. I actually live in around the Corning area. So I'm close by you. I'm a RIT grad. So I know Rochester well. And actually have been perusing some of the groups. So had been on a UX group that it seems they don't meet up too often. So actually happened to find this group and thought I'd check you guys out and see the topics here. I'm actually my role, or my current role, if COVID didn't get in the way of it, but I was actually managing Corning's enterprise website. So worked for Corning, obviously.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What do you think about what you've heard about Rochester a little bit? You haven't heard the whole story. It was mostly about me and then a little bit from Rob.
Yeah.
But from an outsider's perspective, does it strike you as what you would think of Rochester? Like, I know you're nearby, but like the city of Rochester, is that how you would read it?
Yeah, I've actually been really curious about, you spoke a lot about the startups, pockets of startups that are coming, and I've often wondered and tried to kind of explore a bit on who those startups are. Just out of curiosity, obviously knowing how the corporations are being affected. And I actually would say, I tend to believe that that's going to happen in a lot of areas. Maybe it's not the .com, but I tend to believe that some of those startups are going to start to really take flight, given obviously all the technology advancements that we've experienced. And then, just the climate that we're in right now. I think a lot of that seems to be evolving. So I found your comments around that interesting. Wondered opportunity to explore that a bit more. Does this group have a lot of folks that are involved in those startups, and kind of how have you all met? I guess I don't know what the history of this group is, but certainly you have me intrigued.
I'll let George speak to the first, the kind of history of the group, because he knows better than most on the call. But I'd be happy to come back after you're done talking, George. If you want me to speak to the startup kind of realm, I'd be happy to do that too.
Sure. Let's see. When I was working at Brand Networks in Rochester, so they were a Boston-based startup where the CTO, co-founder, lived in Rochester. He's actually the CEO now, so Mike Garson, in case anybody wants to know. Okay. I just had kind of a whim to see, like, can I create a Slack channel that has all of Rochester software engineers in it? Because a friend of mine was living in Philadelphia. That's where I had lived for a little while before moving back to Rochester. They started a Slack of software engineers, and I said, I bet I can grow faster than you. I don't know if that was true. They have a much larger market. It's much easier for them. But no, I think I just did that. And then at that time, I was also running a meetup group in functional programming.
Okay.
And I can tell you that there aren't very many people who give a damn about functional programming, at least sufficiently to go to a meetup every month.
Yeah.
But one thing I started noticing at that time too was people, or a lot of meetup groups were kind of coming and going. And like you mentioned with the UX group that doesn't meet that often, there was hackers in a chapter here as well around that time. And I was going to a lot of these meetups, but I was seeing a lot of them fail. Like the organizer just didn't want to do it after so many years.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Finding a place to host events is a pain. I honestly am so thankful for the pandemic, at least in that regard.
Right.
Millions of other reasons why it's horrible, but like that one, just proving that we can succeed on a virtual meetup, that's been huge. So that eliminates so much of my efforts.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then we had the meetup group, we had the Slack channel, kind of doing like a high touch angle for interacting like we're doing now, chatting, but then also having the lingering aspect of it to keep the conversation going, I think was what the original website said. But yeah, speaking of website, rock.dev.
That's really the interest that I have, right? I think that what I recognize as a challenge is, especially as we're talking about innovation, it takes a lot to go beyond the bounds of what you're assigned. And you talked a little bit, Matt, initially about being able to deal with the unexpected and actually welcoming that.
Yep.
And I think that's what a lot of these companies lose, right? There's an expectation around how things need to be delivered, and you're not always answering the question or the problem that's at hand because of that.
Yep.
You're doing the status quo because this is the way that it works, and I think that's.
And sometimes that way that it works doesn't even always work, would be my argument. Like,
I agree. And it's repeated, right? Like you mentioned about U of R, it's worked for the company. It's disruptive to change it. So you tend to, toe the line and do it that way because that's the way it's always been done. It's a similar environment at Corning in some ways. It's challenging to change that. So I think I appreciate the conversation around really trying to get beyond that and starting to push the borders, the boundaries that you have to love what you do, to be effective in what you do, and to really bring about a good product as a result of that. I think that takes a really, it's an individual's approach. It's unique to see in the setting of a company. I've been at a few agencies where that's been the case, and I've worked with some really creative individuals that really like to push the boundaries. So I've worked at some of those places, but I do feel that it's very unique.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the things that I would say is I tell people discomfort is the companion of change. Right. So if you look to eliminate all discomfort from your life, one of the things you're doing is removing all opportunities for change.
Absolutely.
And there's, I think, a very big, let's say, corporate meta mantra, like that gets chanted at the highest levels of like, thou shalt not cause discomfort. And I think that's where innovation dies, is when people like, I think back on when I was I grew really fast one year in my life. I grew like 5 or 6 inches in a year, and I was in pain all the time. And because I was growing, and I think the same thing happens to your brain. And sorry, Siri or Sri, I'm not sure if you were going to say something there. It kind of looked like you were flickering on your microphone, but that's something that is very hard to get through the corporate wall, is to say you will experience some discomfort while change is happening. And you'll feel it in your entire organization. People don't, especially if it's a publicly traded company or one that's like on the critical care network, like a hospital, right? So like Paychex is publicly traded. University of Rochester, they view that as a critical component of the Rochester economy.
Yeah.
Generating system-wide discomfort is not something that's high on people's priority, but it's also the way that you get pushed towards change. And that's one of the only things that those big corporations respond to is like legal changes from the federal government.
Yes.
And I think that's why, because that's when they feel the discomfort at a systematic level. So one of the things I would encourage is, if you're trying to make this happen, align yourself to the changes that are being pressured by outside forces. And that's what I'm doing at Paychex. There's this big legislative change that happened, and you basically just say, I'm going to use this legislative change as an opportunity to start pushing for some of the changes that need to be made that are not. Sorry, my dogs are coming inside right now.
It's okay. My kids were just in here, so.
But I think all your call outs are right in that it is a little bit unusual to have an individual kind of turning the screws on that at a big company. I think that is true.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
I see your hand was up.
Yep. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, very good. I was checking your website, Paychex. I assume that with the PPP forgiveness situation, I think you may have more customers coming to your website.
On Paychex? Or
yeah, because people need to pay themselves back, especially entrepreneurs, to make sure that their PPP loans will be forgiven. I don't know if they are using Paychex to do so, but it's not really the question that I want to ask. This is just like a comment. My question is about your book. Can you I would like to learn about your experience, the process of writing and positioning in different websites.
Sure.
Maybe book this, different websites like Amazon or the other ones.
Yep.
Like how to sell, how to market, how to position, how
Yep.
to even profit. It would be helpful, I think, for the people who. It's more easier, I assume, nowadays to write book versus how it was in the past.
Depends on how far in the past you look.
Let's say 20 years or 15 years. Like you have to convince a publisher that they will print your book, right? So
Nope, you don't have to. So it depends on what kind of person you are. So I had never published a book before, and I just said I'm going to self-publish. But I fully recognize that I'm kind of a wild man on that front. But I wrote, edited, self-edited, self-published, and distributed the book all myself while I was doing all the other stuff that I'm talking about.
That's the part that because I'm also writing several books right now. So I didn't start researching how to publish them yet.
Yep.
But that's why I wanted to learn from your experience. How did you proceed all these matters?
Let me put my email in the chat, but I'll try and do a quick justice to that. I can't promise I'll be able to get through everything, but feel free to just.
We will make a quick answer. We don't want to take too much time of others as well.
It's more that I would like to be involved with what you're doing, because I think that, I've had a couple of my friends come out of the woodworks and say, we have a book idea that we'd really like to figure out how to publish it. And I'm having this conversation with people now on an ongoing basis about like, how do you get your ideas out of your head onto paper and start the process of writing a book? And it's not all as easy as people think it is.
Yeah.
It probably took me 2 months. I joke that it took me 33 years to write the book because I'm 33 years old, but it took me 2 months to get it in a format that I liked. And after the 2 months of getting it in a format that I liked, it took me like another 2 whole months of even harder work to get it into Amazon and print. And I actually printed it. Hold on, I'll grab it right here. I'll show you what I did. So I actually printed a full draft version that looks like this.
Oh, you printed by yourself?
Yeah. I printed and published it myself. Well, I didn't print it myself. I used a printing service myself. But I printed this up as a draft version and gave it out to my family members. And if you buy the book on Amazon, it actually looks completely different than this. It's got all capital letters on the top. I changed a bunch of the different graphics and moved them around. And then I changed the structure of the words on the inside. All right, you won't be able to read it because the camera's going to show it backwards here. But I very much believe in the power of rough drafts. So what I would say is if you have a bunch of books that are kind of stuck in your head, one of the things I would encourage you to do is just print them. Like print them right now and then look at them, hand them out to other people and let other people start making it better, because they will have more time and more concise feedback to you than you will be able to have for yourself. And that's what I do with pretty much everything. Like I'm launching a business right now, and before I even had like my first customer, I sent the entire business plan to like 30 people in Rochester and just said, if anyone else wants to try and start this thing, go ahead, I'll show you how to do it. But I know that I can do it right. And I know that this business needs to exist. And I front all of that right up front. And I record my meetings when I do stuff like this, when I show things off, because I like people being information aware more than I like people kind of hiding that information and keeping it within themselves.
Yeah. Like Elon Musk say, they are happy to other people copy their innovations, right? It's okay to copy me as long as you can do better.
Yeah, I didn't know he said that, but I agree with that.
Yeah, if it's going to help the humanity, you can copy me. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I like that quote.
Yeah.
So someone sent Lean Pub in there. Looks like Chris put that in there.
But I'm really like, what about like publishing it, like putting in the different marketplaces, like the marketing part of things?
Yep.
Even like profiting from it, even to be, to make New York best time seller, why not, right? So this process, I think, is unique and important. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say if it's something you're interested in, I don't know how interested everyone else is, but why don't we put together a side conversation on that? Because I think that process of how to figure out if you have something good, then how to publish it, how to print it up and get it kind of distributed in these different markets you're talking about. I think that's a big enough conversation and talking point all by itself. And I would love to just set up a meeting where, I don't know your first name, H. Ozal.
Hassan, I put my email to Hassan it's my personal email. I have different emails for different startups and the projects we have, but Hassan is also my first name. Actually, I have many friends in Rochester. I used to live in Manhattan. I drive there. It was a very long drive. I know the area very well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, well, I know one person who drove from Manhattan to Rochester who dropped me a dog off. And that wouldn't be you, would it? That's how I got my first dog, is someone drove from Manhattan to Rochester.
No, it wasn't me. But
wasn't
it was cool.
That would be too much of a coincidence, I think. But that kind of stuff happens around Rochester. Yeah, definitely. So, Halson, throw me your email address and tell me if I ever say your name incorrectly.
Sure.
But throw me your email address and let's put something together. And anyone else who's interested, do the same. I put my email in there. I'm mattnia.harp@gmail.com. If that's something that you're interested in, just look in the Zoom chat, email me, say you're interested, and I'll put together a conference call type of meeting where I just walk through what it was like to publish my first book. And I'm very happy to be very transparent about it. I think it's an important skill set for people to know kind of how it can be done.
Thank you.
We can record it too.
Yeah. I also would like to thank Ping Wang. He's the one invited me here. So I just want to mention his name. Thank you.
Nice.
Thanks, Hazan.
Okay. Glad to have everyone here.
Yeah. Just a FYI, this is a contingent from Taiwan, actually. Hazan, I think you're in Taiwan as well, correct?
Yeah, I'm currently in Taipei. That's
nice.
right.
Yeah. So we're coming to you guys from all the way across the world. We have a sister program in Buffalo, New York, through Techstars. So that's how we found out about this. So it's really cool. This is really informative. Thanks so much, Matt.
Awesome. Nice. Over the past, don't at all test me, but the past couple months, I have been learning Chinese. So awesome. Yeah, that's been an interesting ride trying to do that. I'm sticking with a simplified, and I'm pretty sure Taiwan does not use simplified.
Correct. We use traditional. Yep.
So, oops.
Also,
but I have to start
Taiwan
somewhere.
For anyone that's still confused, it's a completely separate, a different entity from China. So if there's still any remaining confusion, hopefully that's been resolved now.
Yes. And now, yeah, there's a fun history there to learn for anybody who hasn't covered that. So one thing that we mentioned earlier was like startups in Rochester. And I think that's a pretty good segue, talking about Techstars and the Buffalo contingent. Matt, you mentioned vetting startup ideas a little earlier.
Yep.
And I remember earlier today, yesterday, I can't remember, in the Rock Dev Slack, someone was asking about how to vet an idea so that you know if it's worth working at. If they're in a very early stage, they haven't closed their seed round yet. How do you know if it's a safe place to go? Or how do you know if it's worth investing in? From
Safe
either
is
end.
probably not the right word there, right? I mean,
Well, I think there is half of the answer has to be what is sufficiently safe, but for you. But I think there's also the aspect of how do I evaluate at all so that I can determine sufficient safety. Right? Like, is this just a completely bogus idea and it's not going to go anywhere, or is it something that I can give a year to? I can give 2 years to.
Yep. So I got some thoughts. Why don't I pause right now, because a bunch of people went off mute. Sounds like they want to say something, but go ahead and I'll kind of back clean up on this one. Anyone else have ideas there?
I mean, there was a bunch of stuff in the discussion, and there are a lot of angel investing websites that give a bunch of good pointers.
So I got one.
Yeah.
So 7 years ago, I had a recruiter on LinkedIn just reach out to me, and it kind of felt like one of those phishing emails, or calls. But I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna reply, and I'm just gonna get some interview practice.
Sure.
Come to find out, the company was all of two guys, a CTO and a CEO, and they just closed their first round of investing. And my answer is that you'll never be safe. But the funny part is, like, why do you need to be safe? You're just a software engineer. And so, like, when the HR lady in my exit interview, she was like, well, are you worried this company is going to go out of business? And I'm like, well, given everything we know about startups, 90% will fail in the first year. And a 10% succeeds, 90% fails in the second year. And I told her, like, look, I am confident that within 2 years, I'm going to be looking for a different job.
Yep.
Who cares? I'm just a software engineer. I can find a job anywhere I want.
Yep. It's a good attitude. That's an excellent attitude.
The funny part is that this company just sold to VMware for $2.1 billion.
Well, there you go.
The funny part. Yep.
But yeah, like, and that's the thing is, like, I mean, even with family and everything else, it's just a job.
Well, when you come in at that stage, so I would say there might be two different stages there. Like if you aren't coming in as a technical co-founder and you're just coming in as the person who is like the painter on the job, then it is just a job, right? And I think that's what you're speaking to, right, Dennis?
Yep.
Yeah, it's a trickier thing when people are asking for like equity returns and potentially putting you in a co-founder role, and that's the part where it can get a little bit dicier, because very often you're expected to wait longer before getting your financial recapitulation.
I want to throw one thing out there too. Know if you're asked to be a co-founder, whether or not they say the words that you're being a co-founder, because there will be someone who tries to pay you a lot less than you're worth for these early stage startups. And if that is true, if you are being asked to take a pay cut, then you better be getting some equity for that. If you're sufficiently early, the risk is sufficiently high, and you're the first technical resource on a software project, that's called co-founding.
So
yeah, I agree with that. And that would be part of my point as well, is really if you have something that's like a hardcore tech, like I can actually guess what company Dennis is talking about, but if he was the first person onto that company, then you are de facto the CTO. Like that, you should be carrying a label that comes with something like that, or chief of product or something like that. You know what I mean? You're up there. You're on the co-founding team. So sometimes there can be a mismatch there.
So ours was a little bit different, and that's actually the comment that George made. You made like right in the beginning, is that when you found a company, you're gonna populate with a bunch of like really junior college people and get the cheap labor.
Yeah.
When I joined this company, I was 33 years old, and I was the youngest engineer. And these guys basically said, we're gonna hire 7 engineers. That's gonna be our entire dev team, and we're gonna pay them competitive wages. Yeah. So in that regard, maybe they were a little bit different. So I actually didn't get a pay cut.
Well, it's not. So yeah, I just want to maybe clarify that earlier point of your founding, or I guess your early engineering team has to be juniors. They're also the ones who can afford the most risk, right? If you are a single parent with two kids, your risk tolerance necessarily is lower, right? But your 24-year-old just graduated college more than likely does not have children, right? More than likely is living in an apartment, more than likely, or actually guaranteed, can still go on to their parents' health benefits. They don't have to worry about paying for those. Like, we have somewhat structured, and even through even more recent legislation in the past 10 years, like with the Affordable Care Act, have allowed younger people to be even more risk tolerant. And I think that's a good thing. I think we should expand upon that. That also goes to my my floor comments about risk earlier. So, yeah.
George, I took a look back at that conversation thread, and so just for everyone's context, this person was basically asking, they're a first-time potential investor. Really, it sounds like a first-time potential founder as well. And they basically asked, like, how do I know what questions to ask? They weren't even asking, like, what are the answers to the questions? Like, how do I know what questions to ask?
Right.
And that is, so the Techner thing that I'm talking about, that plugs into that space. I'm launching a product. I'm launching a company that has a product that sits exactly in that space where that question is kind of asked, and you're pointed into directions of educational material or assessment material to figure out, to George's point, like, what role in this company should you actually have? Is this something that's at an earlier stage than what it sounded like? Were you oversold on the level of development that's been done? Thank you, Ping Wang. You're very welcome. And thank you for inviting people. That was kind of cool. But the Techner proposition is that kind of void that people are met with when they say, what is this thing that I'm being sold on? What is this business that I'm being sold on? That's where I want Techner to step in right there. That's where we're positioned to step in. It's for the first-time founder or the new founder who has a new idea before it gets to anything close to the stage that Dennis just referred to, which is like a $2 billion acquisition.
One thing I definitely just generally recommend in career paths is finding the startup that is growing already. Those are just fun environments to be in.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say that's true, and you can kind of catch some of the wave, but it also means that you are not always setting your own tone that you want to have. Like, there's pros and cons there, right?
Yeah, so I like to kind of think of it like a Z pattern for change, like as you're changing jobs, right? Going to that company that is on that rise means that more than likely you could become a lead, maybe quicker than you would have otherwise, or maybe you should have otherwise. At least I can kind of say that for my own career. I became a manager and then learned that I sucked at it pretty quickly. I think I could do better now than I did then, but holy crap. But it was a fast-growing company. There was no one else to do it, right? You have to fill gaps. But then if you really want to continue on that, because you got that title increase, you can go over to a bigger company that has the cash, that has the stability with that title increase, and now you're flattening off. You're setting the floor higher, kind of like you were talking about earlier with the fail and succeed going up. Same idea.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
I think that has a lot to do with just a growing company, not necessarily a startup, though, right? I mean, if Paychex is growing a lot right now, you still have those opportunities there. I remember talking to a guy who joined Kodak in 1963, and he got a new position every 6 months because they were just growing so fast, and it certainly wasn't a startup in 1963.
Yes, I agree. I think there's going to be a greater likelihood that a penny stock is going to grow quickly and double much more than your $1,000 Google stock or whatever, right? It's easier to double when you're small.
Yeah,
right?
it's the Bitcoin argument, right, or the cryptocurrency argument. You can buy it for a penny, and when it blows up by like 10,000%. or something.
Right. Now, the other side with those high growth startups, they also go down quickly, right? I have worked at startups three. And I'm going to define startup as company less than 5 years old when I joined, where they grew quick, and then layoffs.
Yep.
Massive layoffs. A
Usually
couple of them are doing better now.
Usually that's in preparation for a funding round too.
Yes. Yep. Got to liquidate.
That's just wrong in lots of ways.
Yeah, we can also talk about how some local companies have publicly, or founders at least, have publicly admitted on camera that they are atrocious at hiring.
Yeah.
And when they grow fast, they just hire anybody.
Yep.
And turns out that's a risk.
Yep.
Right? You're just adding to your liability sheet. And then when it's time for that next round of funding, what do you have to do? And then you claim it's about performance and all, yeah, whatever. It's a whole, yeah.
It's a problem. That's why, before we turned the cameras on, or before everyone was on, I was saying for the product that I'm currently launching, it actually motivated people so much they were willing to work for nothing. And it's one of the reasons that I don't like letting people work for nothing. I insist on like a cash payment, because I want something on the balance sheet that says that I paid this person this way without sacrificing equity, right? And that, or if I did make an equity swap, that it was a relatively mitigated equity swap where I vetted the person out ahead of time by paying them a salary or like a weekly wage or something like that as a test bed before I let them come on as an equity stake held person within the company. So that was a lot of information. Basically what I'm saying is I create like a test environment to see what I want a new developer to do in my company before I let them in. And I pay them differently during that kind of courting stage than once the marriage is finalized.
That's a funny way to put it.
Well, it's what it is, right? Like,
It really is.
It's the old ball and chain.
Yeah, like when I was doing that side work.
Somebody's shaking a gun at me.
Well, it's funny. Like when I was doing that that side work, I was doing it with someone else, right? And she's a woman, so we essentially said like we're our second marriage.
Yep.
Because it very much is, right? Like we signed
100%.
documents together. We have 50-50 ownership. We split up. There's a whole procedure we have to go through, right? Like it's not fake. It's just I guess the difference is there is a mandatory prenup. Right?
You're not allowed to have sex with them.
Yes, all right. There's more than one big difference, I guess, yes.
Sorry.
Some things go without saying, Matt.
Okay, fair enough.
And they're better that way, yeah.
Yeah.
So how do the single person startups fit into this pantheon?
They
You don't
usually
see a single
Plenty
fail.
of sole consultants.
Yeah, I mean, they usually fail is my take. And as someone who tried like the single person solopreneur type of thing, there is just too much work to be done for one human mind to really be able to get their head around it. Unless you're doing something that is like, if you're opening a chicken and beer restaurant or whatever, I was talking with someone recently. He said he was going to open a restaurant, and that's all that the business idea was. Like that you can do. You can open a food truck. You can open a restaurant by yourself. Anything more complicated than that, even like printing a T-shirt effectively, you really need at least two people to do it. And I have yet to see any evidence to the contrary.
So
Well, I think
you're saying if there's no product, it is not in this world?
Right.
Say that again?
So you're saying if there's no product, it's not part of this world? Consultants?
Oh, well, so like a consultant, I think of them as someone who's making, like, are they actively the person consulting as well as the person owning the business?
If it's a single person, yeah.
Then that's not an entrepreneurship play. That's a job play. All they've done is find themselves a job. They haven't actually started a business. They're just finding clientele for their job repeatedly.
Right.
Right, entrepreneurship is...
Delineation I've always heard is, either you're self-employed and you create a job for yourself, whereas entrepreneurship, the idea is that you build a business which eventually just self-sustains itself.
right? You end up working on the business rather than working in the business. That's the transition mechanism, right? Is if you find that you are still the person who's being tapped on the shoulder all the time, and I'll just use you as an example, Chris, you start an independent consulting company, but you're the only person who is doing that work. You're always the person being tapped on the shoulder to answer, what does this business do, right? And then you have to go do that thing as well, which is to say, where you would really become an entrepreneur, in my mind, the way I see this kind of space, is if you were holding the reins of like a variety of, and holding the reins is a bad analogy, but holding the reins of a variety of different consultants who you could source out to all these other people and make money by the connection of talent to demand for talent, right? Like that's the level that it becomes an entrepreneurship play, and because it becomes a business rather than what people call like a lifestyle business, where it's just they've built themselves a job and they keep operating underneath the same moniker. Would you agree with that, Dennis? I think you were kind of saying something.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, I think there is a difference in kind there between the two. I have seen, though, people who are doing the consulting on their own eventually have to bring in a second person because the work that they're doing at a company is more than they themselves can handle. So at that point, they start to employ people. And if that one extra becomes two extra, there is a possibility there. And you really don't ever have to give that up, too. If it's just making a little bit on the side even, right? Like maybe the founder goes back, has a day job, becomes an engineering manager at a local company, but still has that other person at the other job bringing in 10% cut.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people that start off as consultants end up backing into, creating a business, but that wasn't the real intent necessarily. I mean, I've always thought the difference is, as a consultant, but like Matt says, you're doing all the work. When you actually have a business, you can go on vacation and the work continues.
That's a great line. Yeah, if you can go on vacation and the work continues, you have a business.
Yep, I agree with that. And the degree to which it continues might be like, that's something that you can throw qualifiers out there all the time. But if you could go on, let's just say like a 3-day, like if you took a long weekend and the 3 or 4 days of consecutive not working on the business, everything would be okay. You've created a business. If you know that during that 3 to 4 day break, you're going to get like 100 emails that say like, holy shit, everything's on fire. Like, what the hell do I do? And all these different things. You made a job for yourself. People call that a lifestyle company.
So if we turn back to the education experience for a moment, you talked about spending time with these two companies doing private schools, basically.
Yep.
It seems like the whole educational system is still a big problem in Rochester area in particular, in the country in general.
That's broken.
It's very broken. We throw a ton of money at it and we get pretty abysmal results overall.
Agree.
So, I mean, it sounded like you had a little bit of success in there. And do you think that success is something that could be replicated? I mean,
yes, I do.
Is that something you want to get back into at some point?
Yeah, I do want to get back into it. And I was recently, so first of all, thank you. That's like an ultra considerate question. And that, like, I can only imagine that I'd love to like talk with you this more, because you very much tagged into something that I'm very interested very quickly. I would like to see it happen, but I think I would do it very differently when I started. I think that I learned a lot of things about what didn't work, and that's kind of like the failure side of it. But I learned a ton of things about what did work as well. I think I could do it as a school. I also think I could do it as a child age, like let's say 4th grade and up, Founders Institute for kids. And that's something that I've been kind of talking about and saying, like, what if we just took kids' ideas and treated them as good business ideas, or potentially good business ideas that need refinement, the same way that we do with adult ideas. And what if that was what we actually started training people to do, is refine their ideas in a systematic way, and taught that very young, and made that kind of the focus of school being on refining ideas rather than refining what you might call like regurgitation of a bunch of points that they heard in a book, or a bunch of algorithmic methods of solving a math problem that they might have a better way of doing it on their own. And I'm very much an advocate for people who are willing to push back on what is the prescribed, assumed good way of teaching people things. And that's why I call what I did, it was kind of a renegade school at times. Like we bucked a lot of assumptions. I bucked a lot of assumptions when I set these things up. But to directly answer your question, yes, it's something that is on my mind almost every day, is how much I would like to do that again. And I miss it. It's something that I feel like I lost, a part of myself earlier than I wanted to, if that makes sense.
Hey, Matt, I got a question. Early on, you mentioned that you were interested in architecture and mechanical engineering.
Yep.
You went on to mention that this is the Rust Belt, and how there's a number of startups and innovation potential here in Rochester. Do you see any innovation potential within the Rust Belt or steel space?
Like actually refining hard metals into a refined product?
Not necessarily, but like in automation sort of way. Do you dabble in hardware at all, or do you mainly focus on digital products?
I dabble. So I'm someone who I've lost track, but I think I have like probably 50 Raspberry Pis in my house that I make them do all different kinds of crazy stuff,
Nice.
which is a little bit more of the computer hardware side. But I also am intrigued by, and I've actually been kind of protecting myself from it because I know how much I'm going to go down a rabbit hole, but 3D printing steel. I like the idea of being able to 3D print steel components. And I've worked very hard. Go ahead.
I think they refer to heavier metals like that as additive manufacturing instead of 3D printing.
I've heard that before. Yeah. So I do know that I'm interested in that, but I also am someone who, like, when I pick up a new hobby or a new interest, I kind of let it consume me at times. And I have a little bit of like an addictive personality on that front, where I want to learn everything I can really, really fast. So I've tried to like kind of hedge against having another thing like that I'm going to learn on really, really fast. Because I know what it would do. It would be like, I'd be up all night for like a week trying to figure out what I could print. Now that being said, I love that stuff. I work with people who, there was a guy at U of R who was working in the laser lab for energetics, and he's building these like high energy plasma containment components, or high energy laser containment components. And I'm just listening to him talk, and I'm like, this sounds like you're only going to ever print one or two of these. They got a patent on it. And what if you could just 3D print the whole thing? And then you only sell like maybe 2 or 3 a year because there's only 2 or 3 lasers that need it. And those type of things really catch my attention. George is putting something here. What does that say, George?
Pleased to meet you.
Pleased to meet you.
Wohungauschen Renchini. I think I pronounced that horribly too. So there's that.
Well, you'll have to look to someone else to verify. But Tom, it's a good question. Like, what could the region actually refine? And I think, there's the refining of metals type of question that you just asked, additive manufacturing. I think that could happen. I think there are places just south of us and just south of that whole region, like Pittsburgh comes to mind. If you go further southwest, like parts of Kentucky, parts of Ohio, southern Ohio, or parts of Missouri, are still like digging up rare earth metals as part of what they're doing. Now, they're not doing it as often. Like surface mining and like deep mining they're both kind of waning from what I understand. But those products could still be getting refined in the United States if we were willing to ship them north like 50 miles, 100 miles. I don't actually see that as something I tend to think that we've gotten to a point in our economy where we use like plastics and stuff like that so much that there's not as much of a demand anymore. Like, think about how much metal used to be used in a car in the 60s, and those things were like entirely metal. And then you got lighter metals, use of aluminum, use of carbon fiber in certain cases, and then plastics. And it's just a very different, like, heavy metal machining is not really as popular in our economy as it once was, and that's okay. I do think the refining of ideas and the refining of people could kind of stakeholder regions, though. I think that that's a real thing. So I have an ask for you all.
Yes.
Okay. I put my email in there already. One of the things I want to know is what would be the best mechanism by which to deliver a speech that would encompass everyone in this room and also more people in Rochester? Like what would be, or more people in Rochester, Buffalo, and the entire Rust Belt? What I've been thinking so far, I'll tell you where I'm at, is just recording me giving the speech into a camera with a teleprompter and then just putting it on YouTube and emailing it to everybody and saying like, share this with everyone. But if there's anything where a live speech could go out or I could stream it or anything like that, I'd be interested to know if anybody has any thoughts. And I do own a couple subscriptions to streaming services as well.
Well, not to not to pollute the idea, but most politicians, when they're trying to sell an idea, they have incorporate into a stump speech that gets made many, many times.
Yeah.
It's. I think the idea that you would give the speech once and you're done, it doesn't make it. I mean, I think the idea of recording and getting out there is a start, but
Agreed.
you want to get invited to lots of different forums to give the speech many, many times.
That's correct. So how would I do that? Like I've thought maybe I could get a TED talk about it or a TEDx talk.
What I was
Right.
going to say. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, it's probably a little longer than most TEDx talks, right?
I'm trying to get it down to like 6 or 7 minutes.
Oh,
Edworthy.
Wow. Okay.
and seed it through social
Yep.
leverage.
So that's mostly like, you're mostly thinking in the same wavelength as I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm feeling like Twitter.
Twitter, maybe a Twitch stream or something like that too.
A Twitch stream or YouTube, and yeah, putting it up on Twitter with some of the popular hashtags.
Yeah, I think just recording it though, and leaving it up to people to find a time to watch it can be an issue, right? I mean, I think a live speech, people have some sense of urgency that they need to watch it then because it may not be available in the future.
Sure.
Put up on YouTube. Oh yeah, I'll get to that next week, and they never watch it.
That's true.
Right, like this recording is going to get, I'm going to guess, 100 views on YouTube in the next like 3 months. Except those views are only going to be in the first 5 minutes.
So I've thought about putting like a link to a YouTube URL in the next version of my book. Like what if right at the end of the book, it was like this person who wrote this book also did this YouTube video, just like, or maybe like a QR code that you can scan and it takes you right to the video. But just things like that, or I have put it on business cards or things like that. And I'm trying to come up with a little bit of an unconventional take on how to market it and get it to market. But I don't think any of those things are wrong. I think one of the hard parts is I probably have to do all of the things that everyone just said and more. Yeah.
People find information in many different ways.
Yep.
Based on need. So I guess it depends on the topic that you're introducing or the various topics, giving them a pathway to that information based on a query that they've made themselves, right? So
yep.
Also leveraging some SEO tactics to maybe drive them to that too. You can kind of build a strategy for that.
The good old SEO tactics. Yeah, I'm right there with you. So, I mean, all of these are the right answers. Like nobody said anything wrong. The hard part about it is that like, I'm one person and I have to do all of it myself. So, you know what I said about solo entrepreneurs, the same thing goes for the solo, whatever pitch speaker person guy.
Well, so that means you have to form an organization.
That's one of the things I was thinking about actually, is maybe it takes an organization to really platform this. And I think I agree with that.
Have you met the Scale FLX guys?
No.
I'm wondering if there's some tie-in there. So in the Rochester Open Coffee Club, the days that you've been, Zach has been there. And the days Zach has, you haven't. So it's kind of like, come on, what's going on? But no, I think that would be a great intro to make. You guys are
please do. I'd love an intro like that. Is FLX for Finger Lakes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who's your target audience for this speech?
Anyone who has considered being an entrepreneur or a founder and has systematically had their idea punched back into their brain.
So Matt,
Because-
you already mentioned TEDx, and a couple of weeks ago, like I was actually disassembling the thing I have in the backyard while listening to the podcast, which was the founder of the Health TED organization.
Yep.
And based on what you just said, it sounds like TED was literally created for people like you.
Yeah, I kind of think so. And it's tough because you kind of have to travel out of Rochester to get on the TED Talks. You can get on the TEDx ones sometimes around here.
Right.
But the actual TED Talks, I would have to go to a bigger city like Toronto or New York City or Boston.
Right. But what about the X?
What about the X? Yeah, no, it's a good, and I think there's kind of a pipeline from the X events to the TED proper events.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of the TED Talks, and I've been in contact. She wasn't very responsive, but I've been in contact with the person who runs some of the TEDx events in Rochester.
Hmm.
And I know that they're kind of scrambling with everything going on with everything being virtual. But maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe that's an opportunity to say, hey, I'll already have this thing pre-recorded, or I'll have it like mostly down pat, and you could just play it right at the event.
Plus, cast a wider net.
Right.
Buffalo, Syracuse,
Wider net. Yeah, I agree.
Albany, just go a bunch of them.
Regional, yeah, at least.
That's a good call out. So as far as priority, I think that's pretty high up there as like the TEDx talks. I have been trying that. If anyone here has a good connection to kind of leverage that, or if anyone has done a TEDx talk in the Rochester or Buffalo region, I would love to put heads together. Just email me, or my email is in the chat. The other thing I would say is I encourage the use of like a hashtag of either Refine Rochester or Refining Rochester or things like that. If you see things like this happening, let's start calling them out. Like when we see someone refining a new business idea, or we see someone refining a part of downtown or things like that. And that's part of the speech that I put together is like, what if we just stop saying Rochester Rust Belt and start saying Rochester Refinement, and just hashtag that, start getting some of this old terminology out of the way, and think about the future or even the present rather than the past of what happened with all these other big companies that left. I think that's a cool idea.
That's a fun topic, talking about the companies that used to be and how we idolize them. They're our golden calf.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they still are, even 15 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, but in any case, I could probably get very passionate about that. Thank you all for the input to that question. So I very much appreciate it. And I appreciate, George, I'm going to give you a special thank you for allowing me to speak today. And I look forward to seeing what people actually thought once they get a chance to digest it and look at it on YouTube. And I see the real comments when I wasn't in the room, and people say, oh man, this guy's a maniac, or something like that.
Sure.
No, it's all good.
I mean, that could also be true.
Yeah, well, they're not mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah, so, all right, I will kill the recording here.